how each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. Let me wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And normally at about this time of year, we are usually talking about Thanksgiving, in large part because some of the items in the news have calmed down, and it's a great time to teach American history. I don't mind doing that a little bit later, but it does seem to me that today has sort of turned into our week in review kind of program. So that's what we're going to do the first hour, have an open line. Lots of things to talk about, and not the least of which is the downing of the Russian airplane yesterday by Turkey. Some other sort of smaller issues, but ones that we wanted to follow up on. One about the clock boy asking for $15 million in compensation and apology because of his arrest over a homemade clock. That happened in the state of Texas. All sorts of facts and figures coming from the Department of Homeland Security saying that over the last 5 years, we've had more immigrants from Muslim nations, just in the last 5 years, than the entire population of the District of Columbia. And so when people are talking about maybe having a pause in terms of whether we want to bring more Syrian refugees in here, just another argument to put on the table and discuss. Also, some that think they found a big mistake in one of the presentations by Donald Trump, but Mark Stein weighs in and points out that the people that actually have given him 4 Pinocchios, the Washington Post, actually have an article that came out that actually does indeed say what he says is at least generally correct, maybe not totally factually correct, and we'll get into that. And, of course, one of the commentaries we've posted here today about these students on college campus. And so you're going to see, if you go to our website, all sorts of articles that we will be talking about today. But most importantly, we'd like to open up the phones, give you a chance to join our conversation. I know on these days, a typical Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and I've done many of these broadcasts over the years, most people are busy scurrying around. Either they're still at work trying to finish off those last few things before they head out the door. I'm getting the sense that more and more people are taking off all of Thanksgiving week, and so some of you may already be at home. You might be shopping, you might be cooking, and you might not have a chance to get to the phone, but we'll give you that opportunity if you'd like to join us. And then, of course, we'll get into some other topics in the second hour. But let's, if we can, talk about Turkey for just a minute. I'll read from a few pieces, one from the Wall Street Journal, in which they talk about a fact that yesterday a pair of Turkish F-16 shot down a Russian plane over Turkish airspace. The Russian President Vladimir Putin called it a stab in the back that would have serious consequences for the Russian-Turkish relationships. And it certainly, of course, maybe will create a reset on some of this as well. Turkish military officials said that the Russian pilots ignored 10 warnings over 5 minutes to return to Syrian airspace before their plane was shot down. Now, I like what the editors of the Wall Street Journal said. This rings true given that there have been warnings in the past about previous intrusions. Just a minute, I'm going to read from a piece by Thomas Rogan that goes into that in more detail, so we'll just hold that for a moment. But more recently, you've had even the Turkish government summon the Russian ambassador to the capital, Ankara, after an attack on ethnic Turkmen in Syria, and expressed that you are bombing civilian Turkish villages that are actually in Syria. And so this has been some question as well. Now, the question that certainly the Wall Street Journal asked, and it's a good one, is why would Mr. Putin risk provoking Turkey with its powerful military and NATO allies? And they say that part of the answer may lie with Moscow's alliance with Iran and the Shiite Muslim proxies in Damascus and in Beirut, who see themselves as competing with the Sunni Muslims for regional dominance. It's also possible that Vladimir Putin is testing the cohesion of NATO. After all, Turkey is part of that, but Turkey certainly has been going its own way. The Turkish president, Erdogan, has been, as they point it there, an impulsive leader who has alienated his allies with his aristocratic instincts and Islamist sympathies. If Russia continues to prick Turkey and NATO fails to support them, it will expose the hollowness of NATO's Article 5 collective defense obligations. If you're not familiar with that, it's been something that's been talked about in the news here. That is, when you attack one NATO ally, you attack all NATO allies, and so the others would come to the defense. I think maybe he wants to see, well, how strong is NATO after all? And of course, if you are interested in the issue of prophecy at all, you've got to wonder how that might fit in with Ezekiel 38 and 39, which we can talk about if you'd like to raise that issue. Certainly that is the case. Thomas Rogan and National Review talked about this battle and some of the things that happened there. But then, about halfway through his commentary, I should say, he says, what does this all mean? He said, first, it's important to note that Vladimir Putin knew that he was dancing on fire. The Russian Air Force has repeatedly intruded into Turkish airspace in recent months, and Turkey has warned that it would take action. As an extension, Turkey last week warned of serious consequences if Russia continued bombing Syrian Turkmen forces near the Turkish border. Moreover, its president, President Erdogan, Putin may have known that he was dealing with a unique adversary because his Turkish opposite sees himself as the master of the Middle East destiny working against Iran. And so this could be, if nothing else, a battle between two big egos and two significant powers. Most people have said, and we've said this on this program many times before, that really the dominant player eventually, and already beginning to be a dominant player in the Middle East, is Turkey and its significance as well. Of course, you can go back to Ezekiel 38 and 39, because you have Gog and Magog and Meshach and Tubal. A lot of those are Turkey. Rosh, that's Russia. You start adding in Put, which is Libya, and you add in Persia. Well, that's, of course, Iran. That's always been called that. Cush, Sudan. You start dealing with the kind of conflict that we're seeing right now. But, of course, the Ezekiel 38 and 39 prophecy talks about all of these nations coming against Israel. We don't see that, no, but we do see at least a lot of those players interacting with one another, and that's kind of intriguing as well. Then, of course, the further comments, he says, of course, Turkey's actions also insert NATO into the situation. If Turkey is now attacked by Russian forces, even in a limited way, it may request American support under NATO's Chapter 5 Collective Self-Defense Protocol, which commits each member state to consider an armed attack against each member state as an armed attack against them all. And so while the United States is expressing sympathy for Russia's loss, it may also warn Russia against escalation. And we see ourselves right now in an interesting situation where you have Vladimir Putin. Of course, you have the President Erdogan in Turkey. And, of course, you also have, I might add, the President, Barack Obama, in the midst of all of this as well. Let's take a break, though. I want to give you a chance to join the conversation on the downing of a Russian plane in Turkey. But also, when we come back, a couple other issues I want to put on the table. You might remember Ahmad Mohammed. He is oftentimes referred to as the clock boy. He received all sorts of accolades afterwards, and actually was invited to various countries, and even given the possibility of a scholarship, invited to the White House. We have a picture right here of him meeting President Obama at the White House. But he says, no, I was embarrassed, and so we deserve $15 million. And if we don't get $10 million from the city of Irving and $5 million from the school district and a written apology, we're going to take you to court. I'd love to get some of your comments on that. And, of course, then we'll talk about this issue of immigration. 680,000 individuals so far from Muslim countries that have come in just the last 5 years. Probably that many more coming in the future. And how does that affect maybe your thoughts about bringing in so many more Muslims from various countries, including Syria? We have lots to talk about. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Thanksgiving is tomorrow, and I suspect that you are doing lots of things to get ready for this special day. Let me suggest you add one more item to your to-do list.
Visit our website and download a copy of my Thanksgiving quiz. Thanksgiving is a wonderful time to gather as a family, but I also believe that it can be a great time to teach our children and grandchildren about America's godly heritage. I created this short quiz to be a conversation starter around the Thanksgiving table. You know, we used to go around the table before the meal and ask our children to tell us what they were thankful for. After a few years of hearing about how they were thankful for their cat, their doll, their video games, I knew we needed to do something else. The Thanksgiving quiz was born out of that frustration. It has 19 questions and answers on the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact, as well as some questions and answers about the Christian heritage of America. Who were the Pilgrims, and why did they leave Europe for America? Why did they celebrate Thanksgiving? What is the Mayflower Compact, and why is it significant? What lessons did the Pilgrims learn about work and even free enterprise? How did the Christian faith influence America? These are just a few of the sort of questions that you can ask around the table and give short answers. Perhaps it is time to recapture the importance of Thanksgiving. On the bicentennial celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, Daniel Webster declared the following: "Let us not forget the religious character of our origin. Our fathers were brought hither by their high veneration for the Christian religion. They journeyed by its light and labored in its hope, and they sought to incorporate its principles with the elements of their society and diffuse its influence through all their institutions, civil, political, or literary." It is my hope that this quiz will help your family see the importance of Thanksgiving. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Give you a chance to join the conversation as we talk first about the downing of the Russian plane by Turkey. And then also, I've already sort of put on the table, so let me just finish that off and make that a second article on the table, and that is Ahmed Mohammed, his family demanding $15 million compensation and a written apology from the school district and from the city. $10 million from the city of Irving, $5 million from the school district. And again, I recognize that it may have been somewhat awkward for him, but he was not exactly compliant when he was told to put away this clock. And then when it goes off, it rings in the English class. A lot of people got pretty scared. So on the one hand, certainly he did suffer a little bit of embarrassment. I don't know that $15 million is even in the right order of magnitude for that. But let's remember that there was a hashtag I stand with Ahmad. The fact is he was flying all over the world to meet people in other countries. He actually attended a science evening in the White House with the president. Well, of course, he didn't have the clock with him at the time, I might mention. And he also has, we found out, family is now going to be moving to Qatar, that country, and yet they still want to, before they go out the door, $15 million. So if you want to comment about that as well, lots of issues on the table. We can talk about those individually. If you want to take on more than one, that's fine too. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head first to Louisiana, KPAE. Ricky, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kerby. Appreciate it. Yeah, I want to mention about the two Russian jets. You know, Turkey is an ISIS sympathizer because remember when the Paris, 130 people were slaughtered and 350 wounded, and that soccer match in Turkey, the ISIS sympathizers in Turkey, in that soccer match booed the moment of silence. So we know that Turkey is really on ISIS side. And I wish we had Putin for president, because at least he would stop the slaughter of the Christians in the Middle East. Assad, the dictator of Syria, at least he didn't kill Christians when he was the dictator. But ever since Obama's tried to overthrow him, ISIS got in and all the rebels got in, and now they're slaughtering Christians left and right. Thanks to Obama's while we had all these Christian slaughter. And, of course, he's wanting to deport Christians and import terrorists. Go figure that one out.
Well, and also said today and the other day, of course, he spoke today and said, Americans, don't worry. There's no credible threat against the United States. Enjoy your Thanksgiving, sleep well, America, and all that. And a previous one said, I think it's just outrageous that somebody would even talk about a religious test. The exact quote is, when I hear people say, well, maybe we should just admit the Christians but not the Muslims, he says, when I hear political leaders suggesting there should be a religious test for which person who's fleeing from a war-torn country is admitted, that's shameful. Well, first of all, when we actually bring people here in asylum, if they're seeking asylum because of religious persecution, what's the first question we ask them? What religion are you? And so, I again, if you don't know all the facts, it's real easy to get all caught up in this. But when you look at some of the facts, you do have to roll your eye. And I'm with you. We've got to recognize that Turkey may be technically an ally in NATO, but I think before it's all through, we're going to see that Turkey might have a lot more in common with many of the other Muslim countries, because after all, it is a Muslim country. And Erdogan is really taking them in a much more radical direction from what Turkey originally attempted to be a long time ago, because there was really an attempt to try to make it a little bit more of a modern secular nation that had a Muslim background. But that is not where it goes right now, and that's certainly one of the concerns. So, Ricky, I appreciate your phone call today.
All right, thank you.
Happy Thanksgiving, by the way. And let me give each one of you a chance to join the conversation today. 2 issues on the table, and maybe, a third, because when we talk about this issue of immigration, I just mentioned it. We'll get into that more as we get into this call here. 680,000 green cards given to immigrants from Muslim nations over the past 5 years. That number is larger than the number of people in the District of Columbia. And that's, of course, just the ones here legally, not to mention the ones that are here illegally. Chris in California, listening on KYCC, you have the floor. What would you like to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I don't understand why, anybody even want them here. These liberals, they got their head in the sand. These refugees, they don't have a constitution. They have the Quran. They don't have a Bill of Rights. They follow Sharia law. There's a reason why our president wants them here, and I actually believe, not to be a conspiracy theorist, but I think they want chaos here for martial law so he can use his executive orders and become more of a dictator. And as far as Clock Boy, that didn't even look like a clock. If that kid was white, nothing would have happened. And you know what? Look what's happened to this country. If a white kid, was in a school in the Middle East and did the same thing, they probably would have shot him. So, where's the fairness in this world anymore?
Yeah. Well, some of you want to talk about Clock Boy. I just thought I'd put that on the table. I've kind of held that for the last couple of days, but now some people are really starting to say, well, how should the city of Irving respond? For most of you outside of the state of Texas, since I am really today broadcasting from a studio that's just a few miles away from where this decision will have to be made by the city of Irving, and we're familiar with the mayor there, and also the school district, MacArthur High School, we have to recognize that they've got a decision. Do we just, figure out if we can mediate it and pay a little bit less, which still probably would be in the millions, or do we say, this is ridiculous, this is just an extortion attempt, and rely on the jury system? At a time when we have political correctness and people say, well, you should not do anything that might be harmful or intolerant, might be a microaggression or something like that, you have to wonder what that might mean if that goes to trial. But it's just one more issue I want to put on the table and give you a chance to maybe weigh in with some of your comments. Let's continue on this notion of refugees and immigrants for just a minute, and we'll go to North Carolina. Jefferson, thank you for calling today.
Hi, when you listen to people like Mark Steinen and Gavin McGinnis, you start learning that multiculturalist policies are so passive that they are pretty much destroying the West, and you can see it right in front of your eyes.
And I think you're right, because what you are seeing is probably, if you want to understand what it would look like here, look at Europe, because oftentimes Europe is down the road. And what's going to stop, the attempt to eventually move Islam as the dominant religion and the dominant political force in France, for example, or in Brussels, Belgium, since those have been the two places where we've been talking about it the most. And there's nothing, because if the alternative is I want to have Sharia law and everybody live under Sharia law, and I want to establish a universal caliphate. If the only alternative to that is, well, you have your view and I have my view, you have your view of truth and I have my view of truth, guess who wins in that particular intellectual discussion, especially when some of that intellectual discussion is backed up with some kind of violence or a threat of violence or force?
Right. And the problem is that liberals are being so naive. They say, well, we want women's rights, we want homosexuals to not be killed. The problem is that the people you are importing, their culture does not believe that, and they will never believe that.
Sure. The only thing I have as an answer to that is my commentary yesterday. And for those of you that don't read my commentary every day or don't hear it, it was called America's Cultural Disconnect. And it was just a reminder that came from Victor Davis Hanson that there is a disconnected culture. You have some people, as you point out, Jefferson, they're kind of in the elite. They may be the media elite. They may be the political elite. They may be the academic elite. They may be professors on campus. But the point is that oftentimes, especially the political elite, they make decisions that don't affect them directly. I mean, just think about this for a minute. If you're a politician, if you're a government employee, if you're in the media, if you live on one of the coasts, you either live in New York, you live on the Southern California, the West Coast, you're really not affected very much by liberal immigration policies. You are not affected by crime rates because you probably live behind a gated community of some sort. Your income is not lowered dramatically because you have a lot of people here that are willing to work under minimum wage because, after all, they're kind of in the shadows. It doesn't affect you very much, maybe if you go out into a public place, but by and large, you can implement all sorts of policies, you can pass all sorts of bills, and it will never have an impact on you. Even this week, somebody was telling me the plane that Dianne Feinstein travels in. I mean, she doesn't even have to deal with TSA, hardly. She doesn't have to deal with some of the things that we have to deal with when we get on an airplane today. If you're going on an airplane to your Thanksgiving venue, you're dealing with some things that sometimes others don't even have to deal with at all. So you can see that disconnect really hurts us, and it maybe also explains why in many cases they are implementing policies that the vast majority of Americans don't agree with. Anyway, let's take a break. Some of you want to talk about Clock Boy. I'll give you some more facts and figures about immigration. And also, interestingly enough, Mark Stein, since we mentioned just a minute ago, points out that the Washington Post says Donald Trump is wrong. The Washington Post is wrong. We'll show you why right after this.
Charles Spurgeon was a Baptist preacher in the 1800s. He was a consummate wordsmith, delivering powerful biblical messages in language that was as beautiful as it was true. He once said, "You say, if I had a little more, I should be very satisfied. You make a mistake. If you are not content with what you have, you would not be satisfied if it were doubled." Are you content? A way to know is whether you're willing to share your blessings and if you're thankful. Point of View is exceedingly thankful for God's good blessings, and we're glad to share them with you each and every week. As 2015 heads toward a close, no doubt we face a challenging future, but we face it together, and we face it with a God who has promised never to leave us nor forsake us. That is an incomparable reason to be thankful. Thank you for listening, and we thank God for you, not only for listening, but for sacrificing so much to enable us to be here with you. From Kerby and Penna and everyone at Point of View, thank you, and happy Thanksgiving. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Thanksgiving week, and certainly want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving, but at the same time, this is one of those rare opportunities where we have really so many things happening in the news. We've already talked about the downing of the Russian jet. We've talked a little bit, and we're going to have a call here that wants to address the issue of the homemade clock that for all the world looked a little bit like a bomb, and given the fact you couldn't even see under some of the electronics, what if there had been C4? And again, how would somebody get that? Oh, I don't know. Maybe some terrorist would have given it to a child. Have we ever had a child become a suicide bomber at the age of 14? Yeah, I think we have. Okay, so you might have had TNT, might have had some gunpowder under there. It didn't look like he was very evasive at the time. He knew his Miranda rights, so you wonder if he'd even been kind of prepped a little bit. So we've talked about that. The number of immigrants in the last 5 years, 680,000 immigrants just from Muslim countries alone. The president wants to add another 100,000 because those would be those coming from Syria. 100,000 here, 600,000 there. Pretty soon that adds up to lots of real people here. And then we'll get into a couple of other issues in the news. So lots of things that I've put on the table. I'm going to add a few more in just a minute. But let's go back to the phones and take some of those calls. We'll go to Georgia, WGPH. Pat, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
What'd you think?
Well, I think that the young boy, I think that was just, he just did that to be provocative. From what I understand, the clock wasn't really that great of a clock, and it
just took it apart and then put it in a different box. If it was just a clock and it was taken apart, but you still had the container material, he's like, okay, I guess that's a clock. But even so, couldn't you not use a clock to explode something? And,
that's right.
When they asked him about it, he was very evasive. Then it goes off in English class, and then he's being asked all sorts of questions, and he's not answering, and he's being kind of flippant. And again, some 14-year-olds tend to be that way, so I get it, but then he knows his Miranda rights, and now they want $15 million.
That's right. And I think that was the intent all along, probably.
Could have been, certainly been. We do know a little bit more about his father because he's been an activist before. Of course, the family's now going to go to a Muslim country. But we'll see where it plays out from there. And I just thought I'd put that one on the table. We talked about it many weeks ago, and now that it's sort of hit the news again, we'll see how the city of Irving and the school district respond. But I just thought might be one more topic that we could address here on the day before Thanksgiving. So I appreciate your call.
You're welcome.
Again, happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Let's pick up a few more real quickly, and I'll get into one other story or two that I thought might be good to put on the table today. Harlan in Texas, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, sir. I want to, first of all, say that I thank God for your program. I listen to you every day, and it's just wonderful, the ideas and the things that you present on your program. My comments have to do with two things. One is the importation of more refugees. I don't know how many people are familiar with Bridget Gabriel and some of the others who speak about Islam and the true intents and purposes and goals of Islam in regard to Sharia law.
We've had Brigitte Gabriel on. We need to get her on again. So you keep listening, and you'll get a chance to hear from her directly. But go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. I think the insight that she shares into the real nature of Islam and their whole history of violence from the beginning, the inception of the religion itself, is something that all Americans need to know. Personally, I don't think that we should be importing more refugees in without a thorough vetting. And it's not that we don't have compassion as a nation, but we also have to protect our own people. And we have a lot of people who need our help here in our own nation. Secondly, in regard to the clock boy, I say let them sue, because they probably believe that their pressure and this, as you say, extortion is going to force people to accede to their demands. And I personally say let them sue, make them sue, because I do believe that there are enough people who have good enough sense to say, this is not right. These people have a responsibility to protect students. They have a responsibility to the law enforcement. People have a responsibility to protect our communities. So let them sue.
Yeah. And the argument that's being made right now is anybody could look at that clock, and I put that clock in quotes because it was not in the clock box. Remind you, again, that was put in a different box, so it looks different, and you saw a lot of wires, and you saw a timer. And so they say, well, anybody looking at that could conclude that that was not dangerous. Okay, you can look at the picture yourself. We've posted it on the website here before. It looks like it could be dangerous, and that's all I need to know. If some people thought it was dangerous and some did not, how do you want the school district to err? On the side of, everybody should assume that the kids are always going to do the right thing, or when I'm not sure, I take an extra step? Because what if it went off and it did have gunpowder in it? What would we be hearing now? Well, why didn't you take that kid and his device out of the classroom? So, I think they erred on the side of safety, and the only way in which I think they could win, that is the father and Ahmad Muhammad could win, is if they were to find one of the police officers said some disparaging thing about Muslims, then that might sway a jury. But I think if you look at the need for safety, always you want to err on the side of safety and always be sure that there isn't any potential danger. And so I just can't see this one being successful. But again, I know enough about our jury system to know that just get the right jurors in there that are just full of this belief of political correctness and belief that you can't do anything that could be perceived at all as Islamic phobic, and all of a sudden they win the lottery and get millions of dollars into their bank account. So we'll see where it plays out.
Yeah, well, I agree with you entirely that we should err on the side of caution, and my feeling is let them sue.
Well, appreciate your call. And again, happy Thanksgiving. Err on the side of safety, err on the side of caution. When in doubt, don't. I mean, they're just some basic common sense rules that you should always follow. And that's certainly one of those that seem pretty straightforward to me. But we'll see how that plays itself out. Let's take at least one more call on that, and I'm going to get into some other issues in this last segment that we have in the first hour. But we'll head back out to California on KYCC, and this time we'll talk to Leslie. Thank you for calling today.
Hi, Kerby. My comment is that I don't believe that this thing with the clock boy and his parents was innocent, and I use the circumstances that homosexuals and lesbians will purposely target Christian-based businesses, not because they've been denied their rights by anyone else. They could probably go anywhere and get a wedding cake, or just to use as an example. But I think that this is the same thing that's happening with the boy and his parents. I think it was planned, and I think it's to actually challenge people, to challenge, in the same way that the homosexual and lesbians and their agenda are working.
You've made a great connection even to a story that we'll probably cover next week, and that is, you may remember the story, in this case, of Cynthia and Robert Gifford. And they had a home, and they also had a barn, and they allowed the barn to be used for weddings. Well, then you have, as you might imagine, two lesbians come in and say, we want to use it. And they say, well, we're Christian, and this is, we do kind of fun things. We do a fall fun festival. We do a couple of Christian weddings. And, of course, they were fined $10,000, which an additional $3,000 to the two women, $13,000. That just now went to the appeal court. So your point's well taken. I mean, we've seen some of these that have been deliberate. We know, for example, the photographer in New Mexico, one lesbian partner called to the photographer and pretended to actually want photography for a traditional wedding. Then right after that, the other lesbian partner called in and said it was for a lesbian wedding or commencement service. They didn't even have weddings at that time because it wasn't legal even in New Mexico, and that was enough for that individual, Elaine Huguenin, to be fined. And so I think you have the same thing going on here, just as sometimes homosexual groups have gone after a bakery or a florist or a photographer, or in the case we just mentioned a minute ago, the Giffords of a barn. And then when they wouldn't provide that, they were targeted and then, of course, fined. And I think the same sort of thing might have happened here with Ahmed Muhammad. Maybe not, but nevertheless, we in some kind of court case, and especially with the depositions, might find out all sorts of things. Do they really want to go to court when all of a sudden now you can actually depose the father and the mother and the son and find out, all sorts of ideas that they had in their minds and plans that they had? Do they really want to do that? Well, we'll see. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
But I'd also mention that sometimes when we are in the midst of a political campaign, it's good to check what the fact checkers have found, but sometimes we need to fact check the fact checkers, if that makes any sense to you. And there are all sorts of individuals that have made statements that could not be verified. Hillary Clinton over the years has made many of them. We've certainly seen some with Ben Carson. Bernie Sanders, my goodness, you could spend a day, almost every day, with some comment that he makes, and you're going, really, I don't think that's right, and then check it out and go, no, I guess it isn't. But the one they love to target right now, of course, is Donald Trump. And the one that has been in the news was Donald Trump the other day, in kind of a throwaway line. It wasn't like this was a policy statement or anything like that, but okay, he did say that he recalled seeing thousands of Jersey City Muslims celebrating on September 11th, 2001. Well, that led the Washington Post, and in particular, Glenn Kessler, to award 4 Pinocchios to that. And he wrote in this piece that Trump says that he saw with his own eyes on television and that it was well covered, but an extensive examination of news clips from the period turns up nothing. There were some reports of celebrations overseas. Actually, there were quite a few. But anyway, let me go on. And then he continues, Glenn Kessler says, in Muslim countries, but nothing that we can find involving the Arab populations of New Jersey. Well, as soon as that came out, it didn't take long for people to go, wait a minute. Glenn Kessler, you work for the Washington Post. Do you not even read your own newspaper? Because interestingly enough, after a very short search, Powerline's John Hindeker came up with this. In Jersey City, within hours of 2 jetliners plowing into the World Trade Center, law enforcement authorities detained and questioned a number of people who were allegedly seen celebrating the attacks and holding tailgate-style parties on rooftops while they watched the devastation on the other side of the river. You're saying, well, where did that come up from? It came from Kessler's own newspaper, the Washington Post. And so if nothing else, when you see some of these fact checkers, it might be good to, check the fact checkers. Now, to be fair, Glenn Kessler now has changed this, so now it says there were some reports of celebrations overseas in Muslim countries, but nothing that we can find involving the Arab populations of New Jersey, except for unconfirmed reports, which isn't much better. The unconfirmed report comes from what? Your own newspaper. So then it started saying, well, wait a minute. Donald Trump said thousands. And here, even the Washington Post, it just says, what was it? A number of people were actually detained. And they're saying, well, a number of people is not 1,000. No, they're just talking about in the article, a number of people detained just of the other people that were holding tailgate style parties on rooftops while they're watching the devastation. So we could quibble about whether there were thousands or hundreds, but there were more than just a few people. The few people has to do with the people that were detained. But I just, thought I would add that, because if there's one thing we've really tried to do over the years at Point of View is to say, look at some of these news articles with some kind of discernment. And most of the time, I've encouraged you to go and look at those fact checkers, because after all, they've done a good job. There have been some 4 Pinocchios that have been given to our president, certainly to many of the candidates, and they've been well deserved. But even then, sometimes it's worth just checking a little bit further. And that one I thought was kind of intriguing, and I thought I'd pass it on to you. So if around the Thanksgiving table somebody says, can you believe this Donald Trump, he made these statements and then he got 4 Pinocchios in the Washington Post. Not that many people would bring up it. Or he's making all these statements and they're not verified. Well, it turns out that when they're looking for places to point out where he's made a mistake, sometimes the people that say he's made a mistake, they themselves have made a mistake. So let's leave it at that. And one other article that we've posted here today that I thought you might want to read is Tyrannical Students. And it is written, interestingly enough, by Kelsey Harkness, but she had done an interview with Alan Dershowitz. Now, Alan Dershowitz has been on this program with us a couple of times. He was a professor at Harvard Law School for the last 50 years. And let's face it, on most issues, he and I would disagree on most things, and we understand that. And yet I certainly have appreciated when he's come on to talk about the Iran deal, when we've talked about the Hamas tunnels and others. But here is a man who would call himself a progressive, has said that he has voted twice for Barack Obama, is a supporter of Hillary Clinton, but he's kind of really had it with what's happening on the college campus. So for the last couple of minutes here, I thought I'd just read just a few of the excerpts of what Alan Dershowitz from Harvard Law School is saying about what's happening on the campus. He says it's gotten to the point where it is so abused and so hypocritical, and yet nobody is concerned. He said, after 50 years of teaching at Harvard, I have never met a less courageous group of people than tenured faculty. The last thing administrators or faculty want to do is to get into fights with minority students, because then they're perceived as being racist and sexist and homophobes, and these are epithets that are hard to respond to. So it's much easier to go with the flow and be popular, particularly with the most vocal students. Now, again, he's got a Jewish background, a Jewish native from Brooklyn, and yet he's been very concerned about how this is played out as well in terms of some of the anti-Semitism. He pointed out that, for example, quote, at Johns Hopkins University, where I delivered the Milton Eisenhower lectures, I was defaced with Hitler mustaches painted on my face. And he went on to say there's clearly a double standard. Minority students, gay students, transgender students, Arab students generally have a greater leverage and a greater voice, and their grievances are taken far more seriously than the legitimate grievances of Jewish students, Zionist students, Christian students, and conservative students. Gotta love him for saying some of that. One last one, he talks about what happened at Harvard, and we followed that over the years because the president at Harvard at that time was Larry Summers, who actually had served in the Clinton administration, by the way. So again, you're not talking about somebody who's a conservative, okay? But anyway, he says it started at Harvard with Larry Summers being fired, and once the faculty and students saw that they had that kind of power, it's hard not to use it, because if you don't use it, you're regarded as a sellout. He said then it moved to the University of Missouri, where apparently there were some racial tensions and problems. There may have been a good reason for a transition of leadership. That may be correct. But then it moved to the absurd, where at Yale they're spitting at someone who's talking about free speech, or where they banned showing of the vagina monologues because it doesn't take into account transgender. Well, let transgenders write their own plays, he says. Everyone should write their own plays. And he goes on and talks about this, and then talks about at Princeton University, they now want to remove the name of President Woodrow Wilson from the school buildings because he supported racial segregation, which, by the way, I might not necessarily disagree with. But the point is that you're now having individuals storming into offices, demanding resignations of all sorts of individuals. And interestingly enough, a very well-known liberal, progressive, Alan Dershowitz, formerly the professor of law at Harvard University for there over 50 years, is saying these are tyrannical students indeed. Well, we're going to take a break. We'll get into some other issues, but on this Thanksgiving Day, it's maybe good to remember that George Washington, back in 1789, issued a National Day of Thanksgiving in which he said, I do recommend and assign Thursday, the 26th day of November next, to be devoted to the people of these United States to the service of that great and glorious being who is the beneficent author of all that is good, and that is, and that will be. Then we may unite unto him our sincere and humble thanks for his kind care and provision and protection for the plenty which we have enjoyed and the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed. So again, we have had since 1620 and certainly since 1623 celebration of Thanksgiving. We have all sorts of national days of Thanksgiving that have been proclaimed by everybody from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln all the way up to Ronald Reagan, and now establishing it every single year. And so we certainly encourage you to enjoy the Thanksgiving dinner around the table, but I also hope that you'll visit our website, pick up that Thanksgiving quiz, and use that as a way to really teach a little bit more of our American history. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into another topic that I think will be of interest to you, and then, of course, we'll wish you a happy Thanksgiving. For those of you that are going to say goodbye to us, we'll see you back here on Monday.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to talk about the paradox of Jesus Christ. And if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that sometimes I point out about how everybody wants Jesus on their team. I mean, you see individuals marching in gay pride parades saying Jesus did not condemn homosexuality. I've seen bumper stickers that say, "Would Jesus drive an SUV?" As if we would care. But I mean, everybody sort of wants Jesus on their team. But if they really understood the real Jesus, they might have some real questions about that, and that's one of those paradoxes, and a puzzling paradox indeed. And so we're going to spend some time today talking about this book, Jesus Behaving Badly, The Puzzling Paradoxes of the Man from Galilee. It is written by Dr. Mark Strauss. He has his Ph.D. from the University of Aberdeen. He's a professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary, author of a variety of different books, How to Read the Bible in Changing Times, 4 Portraits, One Jesus, An Introduction to Jesus in the Gospels, How to Choose a Translation for All It's Worth. And he certainly knows a lot about those issues of translation because he is the New Testament editor of the Expanded Bible and the Teach the Text commentary. He's also served in the past as the vice chair of the Committee for Bible Translation for the New International Version and is an associate editor of the NIV Study Bible. He comes to us by phone from Bethel Seminary there in San Diego. And certainly, Dr. Strauss, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Great to be with you.
You know, when I mentioned the fact everybody wants Jesus on their team, you, in your class, as I understand, because you talk about this in the book, will actually open the first class by showing a variety of film clips, and they're all over the map because you have things like the greatest story ever told. So here you have kind of an aloof, somewhat stoic type of Jesus. Then you have Godspell, you know, where you have a sort of a clown-faced folk singer. Of course, then you have The Last Temptation of Christ, and of course, that one I won't even say too much about, but it's certainly not orthodox at all. And then you talk about the Jesus who actually is the laughing Jesus and has a water fight with his disciples. I think it illustrates that everybody sort of has created Jesus in their own image. And when you get to the Gospels, you have a lot more complex picture than most people actually have in their watered-down version of Jesus. True?
Yeah, that's right. And we all tend to see Jesus through our own eyes, of course, from within our culture and context. And so you go into an Asian church, and you might see an Asian Jesus on the wall, or an African-American church, you might see an African-looking Jesus on the wall. And then, of course, we know what Jesus looked like with that sandy hair and blue eyes, because we see the real picture of Jesus, right? So we all have a tendency to claim Jesus, and not just Christians, even other world religions claim Jesus. New Age Hindus claim Jesus as their own, and Muslims actually like Jesus. They don't like Christians oftentimes, but they love Jesus because they consider him a great prophet second to Muhammad himself. So yeah, everyone seems to claim Jesus without necessarily reading about the real Jesus.
Yes. And again, just the visual image alone. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I remember when the first time our class went over to a Chinese church in Chinatown in San Francisco, and I look up and go, well, I never thought he would have looked like that, you know, but then why should he look like the way I thought he was? So we're going to look at about a dozen, or a little less than that probably, because we won't get into every chapter, though some of the paradoxes. But these, I think, are important because if you really are an honest reader of the Synoptic Gospels and the Gospel of John, you recognize that and this gets to something else I've talked about as well. I mean, Jesus drives people crazy because one minute, he's overturning tables. As a matter of fact, there's an overturned table on the cover of your book. But before that, he's talking about consider the lilies of the field. On one hand, he's talking about conflict and war and divided families. The next minute, he looks like a pacifist. There are times when Jesus is actually looking very gracious and kind and full of grace, and other times when he seems like a legalist and he seems terribly intolerant. And those paradoxes are things that if you're really going to be a true Christian, you have to take account of and actually embrace all of who Jesus was.
Right, and one of the key theses of the book is that when we get to Jesus at his most paradoxical, we're at his most profound, because that's where we find who he truly is. By resolving these paradoxes in a sense, and we can't obviously completely resolve every paradox, but by resolving them, we get to the essence of his message and his identity.
Well, let's see if we can pick on a few of those paradoxes and see what kind of essence we can understand. One, of course, is this idea of revolutionary or pacifist. This is not just troubling for us. It was troubling for some of the disciples because they saw Jesus as a revolutionary. Those who saw him as a Messiah were expecting him to overturn the Roman Empire. But on the other hand, Jesus talks about loving your enemy, going the second mile, turning the other cheek. How do we make sense of all of that?
Exactly. And he said he's come to bring fire to the earth. He says that he encourages disciples near the end of his life to go out and sell their coat and buy a sword. So what is going on? Is he a violent revolutionary? Reza Aslan recently had a New York Times bestseller called Zealot, where he argues that Jesus was a revolutionary. And when we look at the key passages in the Gospels, I think the key passage to understand, sort of to resolve this paradox and tension, is when John the Baptist, who really expected Jesus, I think, to come as a revolutionary to overthrow the Romans, he's languishing in prison. And he sends his disciples to ask whether Jesus truly is the Messiah, because Jesus doesn't seem, he's doing all these good things. He's healing the sick, he's feeding the multitudes, but he doesn't seem to be sparking revolution against the Romans. And Jesus' response is truly profound. The disciples ask, "Are you the one, or is another coming?" And Jesus says, "Look at what I'm doing. The lame walk, the blind see, the dead are raised, the poor have the good news preached to them." And what he does, he refers back to Isaiah passages that are talking about the new creation. He's not just saying, "Look at my miracles, I'm the powerful Messiah," or "Look at my miracles, I'm a compassionate person." He's saying, "I'm the one who will bring restoration to creation." He's got a much greater plan than just killing a bunch of Romans or overthrowing the Roman Empire. That would do nothing except bring on a new empire, right? He's saying, "I'm coming to reverse the results of the fall, to take us back to not the times of King David, but the times of the Garden of Eden, to reverse what happened in the garden and to bring ultimate restoration." Those passages in Isaiah talk about the desert blooming, talking about the restoration of creation, all disease being gone, all death being gone. This is what he ultimately came to do. And the war that he's waging is against Satan, sin, and death, not just the evils of the Roman world.
Sure. Again, the new heaven and the new earth. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation today with Dr. Mark Strauss. His book is entitled Jesus Behaving Badly, The Puzzling Paradoxes of a Man from Galilee. It is published by InterVarsity Press. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but in case you cannot, we have a link to his website and also a way in which you could order it. And certainly you can look for it in your bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to get a copy of it. And at the same time, let me mention, when we come back, we'll take on another one of those paradoxes. Sometimes Jesus seems really angry, other times loving. Sometimes, he seems like he's actually full of grace, and other times kind of a legalist, if we might be really honest about that. Sometimes he seems like he's pro-family. Sometimes it seems kind of like he's anti-family. How do we sort all that out and much more? These are just a few of the chapters in this book, Jesus Behaving Badly. It is published by InterVarsity Press. And again, about 200 pages. And you can look for it in your local bookstore, or else find out more on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Thanksgiving is tomorrow, and I suspect that you are doing lots of things to get ready for this special day. Let me suggest you add one more item to your to-do list. Visit our website and download a copy of my Thanksgiving quiz. Thanksgiving is a wonderful time to gather as a family, but I also believe that it can be a great time to teach our children and grandchildren about America's godly heritage. I created this short quiz to be a conversation starter around the Thanksgiving table. You know, we used to go around the table before the meal and ask our children to tell us what they were thankful for. After a few years of hearing about how they were thankful for their cat, their doll, their video games, I knew we needed to do something else. The Thanksgiving quiz was born out of that frustration. It has 19 questions and answers on the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact, as well as some questions and answers about the Christian heritage of America. Who were the Pilgrims, and why did they leave Europe for America? Why did they celebrate Thanksgiving? What is the Mayflower Compact, and why is it significant? What lessons did the Pilgrims learn about work and even free enterprise? How did the Christian faith influence America? These are just a few of the sort of questions that you can ask around the table and give short answers. Perhaps it is time to recapture the importance of Thanksgiving. On the bicentennial celebration of the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, Daniel Webster declared the following: "Let us not forget the religious character of our origin. Our fathers were brought hither by their high veneration for the Christian religion. They journeyed by its light and labored in its hope, and they sought to incorporate its principles with the elements of their society and diffuse its influence through all their institutions, civil, political, or literary." It is my hope that this quiz will help your family see the importance of Thanksgiving. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Mark Strauss as we talk about his new book, Jesus Behaving Badly, The Puzzling Paradoxes of the Man from Galilee. And if you'd like to join us a little bit later, we'll open up the phones. This may be just one where you kind of sit back and listen, take some notes, and I would encourage you to do so. If you're interested in the book, we have a way in which you can order it. You can get it in paperback or Kindle, but of course you can also look for it in your local bookstore. Dr. Strauss, let me, if I can, maybe get to the chapter on angry or loving. This one is a puzzle for anybody that has read the Gospels, because on one hand, Jesus is very compassionate to some individuals. On the other hand, it is just almost amazing the things that he would, for example, say to the Pharisees, for example. And I've said that it used to be the most quoted verse in the Bible was John 3:16. I think the most quoted verse now is Matthew 7:1. Do not judge, for you might be judged. Of course, I always like to point out to young people that bring this up to me all the time, well, read down a few more verses, and where he talks about them as dogs and pigs, and, you know, he says a variety of other things. Or go to Matthew 23, look what Jesus says. That doesn't look very loving. It doesn't look very non-judgmental. So how do we sort this one out?
Yeah, on the one hand, Kerby, he says to turn the other cheek, to love your enemies, and then he just rails against the religious leaders, calls them fools, blind guides, hypocrites, murderers, brood of vipers. Basically, your mama was a snake, you know. He calls them tombs with rotting corpses inside. What's going on? Why this kind of name-calling? I think it goes back once again to Jesus' essential message. Jesus is the Messiah. He is proclaiming the kingdom of God. These are Israel's for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now is the time to act. You're either with Jesus or against him. You can't be on the fence. So Jesus calls them to repentance. He calls them to accept the kingdom of God, to respond to his claims. When they reject it, they're on the other side. They're opposing what God is doing. And so then he turns on them and he challenges them. He provokes them to such an extent that they have to respond. I think that's part of the reason, not only because of their hypocrisy and so forth, but to call them, to force their hand, because he knows now he's going to Jerusalem to suffer and to die. And so he's going to challenge them to respond or to reject, and if they reject, then he's going to force their hand by going to Jerusalem, where they'll turn him over to the Romans to be crucified, to accomplish his purpose and plan. So I think he's got a mission, he's got a purpose, he knows what he's doing. He's calling it for what it is, which is either you're for me or you're against me. This is a spiritual war, and you can't be a Switzerland, you can't be neutral in a spiritual war.
And so you have to choose sides. And so when somebody reads this, and you may be aware of this, that if you type in the word Jesus behaving badly, most of the things that pop up are by the skeptics, the new atheists, and others, which I thought was so interesting as you titled the book in that regard, because they say, well, see, that's why we can't follow Jesus. But really, there is a sense in which that is a very significant red line. That's a very significant watershed, whatever metaphor you want to use, because Jesus did not come here for us to just have a nice warm feeling about him. He asked for us to choose our sides, and the Pharisees chose one side, the disciples chose another, and that decision is important to us even to this day.
Right, and in a culture, in a context like where we are in America, where there's religious pluralism, there's not very high stakes. You can choose any religion you want, and for the most part, people are not going to persecute you or certainly kill you for that. But these are questions of life and death ultimately, and in the spiritual war around us, sides have to be taken, and Jesus is calling people to choose for him or against him.
Just the other day I was teaching in a class, and somebody said, you've done a lot of stuff on teaching us this week on apologetics and everything, but how do you bring it down to a close? And I said, well, the last time I did a debate with an atheist, we had a very gracious interchange, but at the end I actually said, this is not just a kind of an intellectual discussion where you can listen and then come back and say, well, I think he had some good points and the other person had a few points. No, this is ultimately related to your eternal destiny. And if indeed what I say is true, and I believe that it is, and I think you've seen some very good evidence that it is indeed true, then it calls for you to make a decision. And as you said, in this sort of politically correct, multicultural kind of idea that we have today, oh, you're a Christian, that's fine. You're a Buddhist, that's fine. You're a Muslim, that's fine. It doesn't really make any difference. An atheist, well, maybe you'll find the truth that is right for you. There are some consequences, and certainly we learned that as we see in your chapter on angry or loving. But to keep this moving, because I want people to have a little bit of an understanding of some of the other chapters, you have a chapter on legalist or grace-filled. This one, again, is interesting because there are times when we see Jesus fulfilling the law. There are other times when his disciples go in and gather food, really just wheat from the field. There are times when they're engaged in all sorts of areas of grace. But then Jesus says, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. It's like, okay, what is all of this about?
Sure, and so many of the parables of Jesus talk about God's love and free grace. The parable of the prodigal son, of course, the classic one, where the father offers, for complete forgiveness without conditions to the son who's returned and squandered the inheritance. And obviously a message of the fact that salvation comes by free grace, and our Father is always there ready to welcome his wayward children back. So the message of grace is so strong and crystal clear and so central to Jesus' message. But then he says, be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect. And he warns, that if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. And well, obviously that's hyperbole. Jesus was a master teacher, and he's using hyperbole to get people's attention. But I do think he's calling for a higher level of righteousness. But it's not something we earn on our own. It's something that happens when we are transformed by the power of God. And I think that transformation that comes through the Spirit of God is really the answer to this paradox, is we do nothing to save ourselves. We come to God empty. We come to God solely on faith. He saves us purely by grace. Spirit as we allow God to transform our lives. He calls his disciples to a higher righteousness, a righteousness far above simply the legalistic righteousness of the Pharisees, one that is truly a heart righteousness. And this goes back to the Old Testament, of course, when God promises that he's going to put his Spirit in his people. When God's final salvation arrives, when the end times arrive, which we're in since the death and resurrection of Jesus, he will give his Spirit to his people, who will indwell him and empower them. We will know God, we will walk with him. So the power to live a life of righteousness comes completely, just like our salvation, it comes completely from God and from his power at work within us.
Wow. Let me, if I can, just before we take a break, talk about the issue of hell. You know, you run into various individuals, Dr. Strauss, that'll say, well, I believe in Jesus, but I don't believe in hell. And yet, certainly Jesus is our gentle and great shepherd, and we certainly see the pastoral aspect of Jesus, but he actually spends more time talking about hell than he does about heaven. And so that's another one of those very profound paradoxes, isn't it?
Yeah, and sometimes people say, oh, the God of the Old Testament, angry, fire and brimstone God, or Paul in the New Testament, he's the angry one. But in fact, Jesus talks about hell far more than the Old Testament talks about it, far more than Paul talks about it. What's going on here? Bertrand Russell, the great opponent of Christianity, basically said he could not believe in Jesus because he talked so much about hell, among other reasons, because he talked so much about hell and because he believed in hell. But we argue in the book that hell is essential for the doctrine of divine justice. God, if God is God, then he's a God not only wrong must be paid for in some way or another. And hell is just the ultimate judgment for those who reject God, who turn away from him. If we don't have hell, then Hitler and Pol Pot and Idi Amin and Saddam Hussein get away with it, get away with the horrific evil that they've propagated. And we know that's not the case because we have a God who is both loving and perfectly just, offering salvation, but then meting out judgment to those who will not respond.
Dr. Mark Strauss with us as we talk about his book, Jesus Behaving Badly, and it is about 200 pages. It is published by InterVarsity Press. You can find out more about it on our website, pointofview.net. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we certainly wanted to let you know about this, and it is a good antidote to some of this politically correct universalist Jesus that we run into today. And all of us in some way or another has probably made Jesus in our own image, and we certainly can maybe roll our eyes, for example, we hear about the New Age Jesus or some other individuals that are trying to make Jesus something that he was not. But it's, I think, helpful for us as well to begin making sure that we actually have the right picture of who he is. And we find that in the Gospels, but we also find that in this book, Jesus Behaving Badly. If you'd like to join us,
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your healthcare. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical healthcare. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Continue our conversation today about the book, Jesus Behaving Badly, The Puzzling Paradoxes of a Man from Galilee. Dr. Mark Strauss is with us, and as we've mentioned before, is a professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary, also serves as the vice chair on the Committee for Bible Translation for the New International Version, and Bible, to mention just a few. And if we can, Dr. Strauss, we can now maybe get into some of the other issues with Jesus that many times skeptics do have problems with. Some of the ones we've talked about here sometimes surface. We just mentioned, of course, Bertrand Russell, a very famous atheist, and I can go through the so-called Daniel Dennett or Sam Harris and others, and they have accused Jesus of various things. So this book not only helps us as Christians understand these issues, but I think it also provides a chance for us to know how to answer some of the questions that people have. And Paul Copan and Sean McDowell and a number of others have written books on it, but this one helps as well. And let me get into the chapter on anti-family or family-friendly, because sometimes you'll have people say, well, which is it? You know, when you're supposed to honor your father and mother, that certainly is the case. But then it seems like Jesus, even in his own life, was repudiating his own family. And he talks about, I came to divide a family. So how do we think through that particular issue? We'll get him back on as soon as we can, and while we're actually dealing with this, we'll talk about this book, Jesus Behaving Badly. Dr. Mark Strauss with us, and we'll get to him in just a minute. But as we are mentioning some of these resources, let me again encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. And as we do so, you'll also notice that we've given you a chance to order the book if you'd like to do so. It's also available on Kindle, paperback, and so those are some great resources that are there for you. We, in a sense, need to recognize that some people have seen Jesus as judgmental, but also we see that in this particular case, we're talking about an individual that seems to be anti-family. So, Dr. Strauss, how do we think about him?
Yeah, Jesus says some striking things that sometimes we don't notice. He says if you want to be his disciple, you have to hate your own family. Luke chapter 14, verse 26. If anyone comes to me, does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. It's kind of a shocking statement.
Yes.
On another time, Jesus' family came to see him. They said, your family is outside looking for you. And Jesus said, who are my family? And pointed to his disciples. And Jesus said, these are my brothers and sisters, those who do the will of my Father. And that's jarring. That's shocking to us. Obviously, the language of hate is hyperbole, once again, meant to get the attention of his listeners. But he's really pointing to something extremely deep, and that is so significant for us. And that is that our true family, when we come to Christ, are the spiritual relationships we have. Our true family is the family of God, even more important than allegiances to country, to clan, to even our physical family. That becomes our true family. And again, in America, we don't sense this so much because we don't tend to be ostracized, hated, even killed for turning to Christ or coming to a new religion. But if you're in the Middle East, we hear about this a lot. If someone comes to Christ from an Islamic background or a Hindu background, they can be disowned. They can lose their family. Their family can hate and even kill them. So Jesus calls for higher allegiances that reflect our true identity, our highest identity, which is identity as children of God and as in the family of believers worldwide. More important than any other human or physical or genetic allegiance that we have.
Well, again, let's pick up on that because you talk about having an opportunity to teach in Romania. To you were those Romanians and others, and I think all of us have found a situation, if we've maybe traveled to another country, just maybe even to a different state in the United States, sometimes we find ourselves with a closer affinity with other Christians than we have the same affinity even with our own blood relatives.
Absolutely, and And hospitality was just a huge value in the first century and among believers. If you came to a town, there were no hotels to go to. You would find Christian believers who would immediately welcome you into their home. And those of us who traveled internationally especially have experienced this, where you arrive, you meet a body of Christians, you go into a church, and you are immediately their brothers and sisters. In Romania, I was overwhelmed because here are believers with next to nothing financially. The economy was in shambles, and yet they would spend, the best that they had to welcome this Christian brother. And so I think that epitomizes really what it means to be part of the family of God. Is we are brothers and sisters. No allegiance is higher than that.
Let's, if we can, take on another criticism of Jesus, that he was racist, which is a phrase that's used a lot now, but it still has a sting to it. Because let's face it, there are times when Jesus talks about, like, Gentile dogs. You say, why would I follow Jesus? He's really kind of a racist, and certainly not an individual that I would want to follow as an individual because of some of the things he had to say.
Yeah, and this is one of those areas we do seem to get a somewhat mixed message, because you've got Jesus telling parables like the Good Samaritan, shocking to his Jewish contemporaries. But then early on in Matthew, he tells his disciples only to go to the lost sheep of Israel, not to go to the Samaritans, not to go to the Gentiles. And then, of course, as you referred, with that account of the Syrophoenician woman, he calls her a dog when she asks him to heal her daughter. And I think in that case, maybe we should start there, because that's such a controversial passage. Yes, it is. Yeah. But I think it's significant what Jesus is doing. There's two schools of thought. Some are saying he's actually calling her a dog, and she changes her mind. But that's not the Jesus we see throughout Scripture. Jesus knows what he's doing, and he's playing with her. He's provoking her faith. He's calling her to claim what is rightfully hers, because even the Old Testament talks about God's salvation ultimately going to the nations. It came to Israel first, but Israel was meant to be a light to the nations. So I think in that episode, he's schooling his disciples, because as soon as he called her a dog, they'd go, amen, that's what these Gentiles are, dogs. But then the dogs even get to pick the crumbs that fall to the floor. And what he's saying in that context is that God's purpose and plan all along was for his salvation to go to the Gentiles. We can get ethnocentric ourselves. We can think that, well, God blesses our nation and our people, but God's salvation is meant for all people everywhere. I love that picture in Revelation chapter 7, where standing before the throne of God are people from every nation, all nations. I think Jesus is provoking his disciples to think hard and to see that their ethnocentrism, their racism, that they are exclusively the ones that God loves, is simply wrong. God has a vision and purpose for all nations of the earth.
So he really wasn't, in a sense, talking to the Syrophoenician woman as much as he was talking about the ones around him, and using that to illustrate something that is very profound. But unless you kind of understand the context, it can be missed by a lot of individuals that just sort of read into it their desire to make Jesus a racist.
Yeah, and I think it's both, actually. I think he's adopting the stereotype of the Jews to provoke his disciples to thought. But he's also provoking her to faith. He wants her to step forward and say, no, this is for me too. I know these blessings are meant for me. It's interesting, as you read through the Gospels, watch how people overcome obstacles to get to Jesus.
Yes.
Like when they uncover the roof to get to Jesus, or when the blind man starts screaming out and people say, shut up. And that's an act of faith. When you're saying, no, I want Jesus. His salvation is for me as well. And whenever that happens, Jesus rewards that faith when people overcome obstacles to reach him, to come to him.
Well, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we've talked about the claim that Jesus was a racist. How about the claim that Jesus was a sexist? And so we'll take in that particular issue and then conclude with a couple of other comments that you can find in the book, Jesus Behaving from Galilee. It is written by Dr. Mark Strauss, and we have information about him and the book on our website, pointofview.net. So I would hope that you will visit that place and find out a little bit more. We've taken on just a few of those arguments made by skeptics against Jesus, but also even the paradoxes that believers face when they oftentimes read the gospel and can't sort this out. And Dr. Mark Strauss has done such a good job of sorting that out, helping us to understand what was being communicated and what indeed was the intent as Jesus was using this in teaching this in the Gospels. Professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary in San Diego. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Dr. Mark Strauss with us as we talk about his book, Jesus Behaving Badly, The Puzzling Paradoxes of the Man from Galilee. And Dr. Strauss, certainly one of the charges you hear from feminists is, well, Christians are sexist. Jesus was sexist. Let's give credit where credit is due. Jesus has an incredible affirmation of women. And when you understand the first century or the ancient world, the kind of opportunities that were provided for women to travel with him, the fact that, of course, they were the first at the tomb, first at the resurrection, they were seen as valuable. Their testimony was included in the Bible. You see a lot of affirmation of women. But on the other hand, the feminists will say, Yeah, but I noticed all the disciples were men, and oftentimes it seems like he is speaking to men only, in which oftentimes the gospel is communicated. So how do we respond?
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right, that if we really look at Jesus in his cultural context, he's incredibly progressive in terms of women. To have women disciples, rabbis of that day simply didn't do that. So it's clear that he's being revolutionary in that sense. But what about the 12 men? Why 12 apostles? And I think, again, we've got something cultural going on. It would have been enormously scandalous for him to have a woman in that inner circle of disciples. There's also the fact who the disciples represent, and I think that's equally important, is the 12 disciples are meant to, in some sense, reflect the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob, and they were 12 sons. And so it's natural, based on the precedent, the Old Testament precedent, that they would be 12 men. Of course, there's a continuing debate in the church as to the leadership role of men and women. We won't get into that
no.
Certainly right now, but I think the idea that Jesus was sexist is just absurd in the context in which he lived. And I think that's one thing we point out a lot in the book, is we always have to read Jesus within his first century historical context, the world in which we live. And we see just striking and astonishing things if we understand him in that historical setting.
Certainly. Let me just be, since we're almost out of time, maybe focus on the positive aspects. Failed prophet or victorious king. One of your longer chapters is on the fact that Jesus is king. And of course, in the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, might be Luke, might be Paul, whoever it is talking about the fact that Jesus is not only priest and prophet, but king. And his kingdom and his kingship is not of this world. Explain that, if you might.
Right, and one of, probably the strongest accusation from liberal critics, from biblical scholars, would be that Jesus claimed to become bringing in the kingdom of God, and yet the kingdom of God did not come to pass. He claimed to be the Messiah, or even just some would say he simply claimed to be a prophet announcing the kingdom of God, and yet he was crucified. So is he a failed prophet? Mm-hmm. Or was he actually victorious? And again, it all focuses and ends with the resurrection, of course. And then, chapter 12, the final chapter, is on that resurrection. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, then whatever his claims were are certainly true and are certainly vindicated. And the claim that he is the Messiah, now at the right hand of the Father, soon to return to establish his ultimate kingdom, is vindicated and demonstrated and confirmed by the reality of the resurrection, that he did not stay dead, but that God rose him from the dead.
Yes, again, chapter 12, I love that. Decaying corpse or resurrected Lord, all the eggs in one Easter basket. Just before we run out of time, though, let's talk about how people can use the book. Dr. Strauss, because it seems to me that for our listeners out there, we have pastors, and they could actually use some of this in sermon preparation. Absolutely. But certainly for people that are teaching a Bible study or a small group or a Bible fellowship, this would be just delightful, because you can actually then maybe through an entire quarter, if you wanted to use this in an effective way, take one of those paradoxes of Jesus, have everybody read it, then come back and read the relevant scriptures and have a discussion. And I think that would be a very significant way to use this book.
Sure, and there's questions at the end of the book for each chapter, and so you can use those questions to spark conversation. And the provocative title should help. The provocative title has a history. InterVarsity had published a book called God Behaving Badly by David Lamb.
Right.
And they decided to spit it off into Jesus Behaving Badly, and they'll also be producing Paul Behaving Badly. And so it's meant to be provocative, to pique people's interest, but that potentially has great evangelistic and apologetic potential, because invite your friends to come and discuss the tough sayings of Jesus, the provocative sayings of Jesus, when he appears to be behaving badly. So both in adult fellowship classes in churches, but even home fellowships where you could invite maybe unbelieving friends in to engage the difficult texts. And again, I think Jesus, when he's at his most difficult, is at his most profound, and we get to the heart of his message.
Well, again, some of the other books we certainly just mentioned in passing, but again, God Behaving Badly. Of course, this one, Jesus Behaving Badly. Future one on Peter or Paul or anybody else behaving badly, and certainly we can do a whole series there, but certainly Paul Behaving Badly will be the next one. And so, again, just a great series, and Dr. Strauss, thank you for your work on the NIV Bible, but also thank you for writing this book, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. It's been great. I appreciate it.
Just before we end, let me mention that, again, that we have our Happy Thanksgiving quiz that is available to you on our website. And in the first hour, I read the proclamation from George Washington in 1789, when indeed he called for the nation to unite with sincere and humble thanks for God's care and protection. Perhaps the most profound of these Thanksgiving proclamations came from Abraham Lincoln, and that happened in 1863. And if you can think about what was on his heart after, of course, Gettysburg and after these long years of the Civil War, when in October of 1863 he called for the last Thursday of November to be a day of thanksgiving and praise, you can see how important that was. And this is when he actually called for a time of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwells in heaven. And so from that point on, we've had Thanksgiving on the last Thursday of November. But then, to be honest, people began to notice that was affecting commerce. So by the 20th, late part of the 20th century, now into the 21st century, they made it the fourth Thursday in November. But I thought I'd also read, just before we're out of time here, a couple of the other proclamations. Perhaps one that many people like to cite comes from President Ronald Reagan in 1985, in which he said, "Let us thank God for our families, friends, and neighbors, and for the joy of this very festival we celebrate in His name. Let every house of worship in the land and every home and every heart be filled with the spirit of gratitude and praise and love on this Thanksgiving Day." Then he goes on to say, "I call upon every citizen of this great nation to gather together in homes and places of worship and offer prayers of praise and gratitude for the many blessings Almighty God has bestowed upon our beloved country." And during that same period of time, actually established a national day of prayer, which takes place in the first Thursday of May. And so we have Thanksgiving on the fourth Thursday in November and the National Day of Prayer on the first Thursday of May. And so those are some very significant events. And on this particular Thanksgiving week, we certainly wanted to encourage you to find some of the material we have made available on the website, pointofview.net. My Thanksgiving quiz, 20 different questions you can ask around the Thanksgiving table to teach about American history and the Christian involvement in our history. And if you happen to be near a radio tomorrow, you can listen to a special broadcast we've done on the history of Thanksgiving, which I think is a good antidote to some of the things that came out this week through National Public Radio and PBS. So again, if you want to listen to that or download it later, I think you'll find it very helpful. Most of all, I want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine and Chris for the help behind the scenes. We certainly will be playing a broadcast, but the next two will be taped. We'll see you back live here on Monday. We'll see you then.